Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe and good morning to our viewers in the United States. Hello, my name is Steve Sokol. I'm the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's virtual discussion. We're joined by ACG Board member Tara Hariharan, who's here in New York, and Dr. Mareike Ohlberg, who's based in Berlin. Tara is Managing Director of Global Macro Research and the Head of Macro Research at NWI Management. It's an emerging markets focused hedge fund here in New York. And among other things, she covers China. Tara, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here, Steve.
And Mareike is a senior fellow in the Indo-Pacific program at the German Marshall Fund, and she also leads the Stockholm China Forum. Mareike, herzlich willkommen.
Thanks for having me.
So when we scheduled this conversation, our intent was really to reflect on German Chancellor Friedrich Merz's trip to China last week, ahead of his trip to Washington and ahead of Donald Trump's planned trip to China, slated for later this month. But I think it's fair to say that Merz's trip to China has been overshadowed by the US and Israeli military operation in Iran, which was launched over the weekend. And I thought that might actually serve as a good starting point for our conversation today, because China has publicly condemned the strikes as a violation of international norms and has called for a halt to these military actions while also avoiding deep military involvement. Mareike, how does China's response to the US and Israeli strikes on Iran reflect some of its broader strategic priorities right now?
Sure. So first, I want to say that it's probably fair to say that China is probably genuinely unhappy about this and genuinely shocked. Generally speaking, any intervention that's geared towards regime change is something that China's leadership is genuinely concerned about, whether that is in Venezuela or now in Iran, right? Nonetheless, even though it has a strong interest in these kinds of, making sure that fellow autocrats don't get harmed, it's been limiting itself to statements, to making fairly strong statements, but statements nonetheless. And the strategy that you can see there, and that you can see more generally, is I think China hopes it can benefit rhetorically by basically telling the world, the source of disorder is the United States. The United States goes out and harms other countries, whereas China would never do that. So it hopes to benefit rhetorically off of that, but it also at the same time hopes to not have to get involved, to not have to take any kind of responsibility for, preserving order, for establishing a firm, accountable, and binding kind of order that it would have to underwrite. That's a level of responsibility that China likes to avoid. It likes to do things that make it look good and that benefit it in very non-committal terms, but it doesn't like to take firm commitments on in the international order. So this is what I see reflected here in this Chinese reaction as well.
So, Tara, I'd like to ask you almost the same question, right? What's your take, and what do you think the Chinese response to these strikes implies or reflects in terms of regional security, but also in terms of the US-China relationship?
Absolutely. I completely agree with Mareike's excellent analysis. Just to add some high frequency color. The first thing is one of the concerns, especially when the Straits of Hormuz were de facto closed, was that this is also going to hurt China in terms of its energy needs, because China is still a large oil importer. However, I'm hearing some news that actually the Iranians are allowing some transfer of Chinese tanker activity in the Straits. So that's an interesting development. Plus, China has stockpiled a lot of oil in the past as a national security precaution. So maybe China won't be as affected by a quick oil price spike as some other market analysts have been concerned about. The second thing, very pertinent, Steve, on the US-China relationship, we still do believe that the talks with President Trump going to visit President Xi in late March are still on. And we had been seeing a lot of, you could say, relative concessions being made by the US, right, including a presumption that there's not going to be additional tariffs levied levied on China and such at this stage. I would say, though, the longer that these Iran strikes persist, we have bigger, broader issues beyond just the geopolitical, because I mentioned energy and the disruption to oil markets, but also very much to the natural gas markets. There's even the fertilizer markets, which will push up food prices. And so we're going to have a cascading set of effects that in the end might end up making it a little bit more difficult for the US and China to meet, completely assuming that Iran is not at all in the picture. I agree that for now China doesn't want to rock the boat, but I think this does become another possible weapon that China uses, let's say a couple of weeks from now, if things haven't subsided in the Middle East, to say to the US, hey, we can't really have a good discussion considering this big conflict is going on.
I mean, obviously, it's early days in the conflict, and we have to see how it unfolds. We have to see how long it lasts. But I think it's really interesting to consider how Beijing might be positioning itself, right? Is it trying to be sort of that diplomatic balancer, if you will, to pick up on some of what Mareike was talking about? Or is it trying to be an outspoken critic of the United States and US unilateralism, despite the fact that Trump will be visiting later in this month? Or is it simply trying to hedge its own interests? Because obviously China has interests in Europe, in the Middle East, with the United States. I guess, there's probably not an easy answer to that question, but do you think the main motivator for Beijing is managing its own interests above and beyond everything else?
Well, I would say that this week especially is important because, after all, this is the start of the National People's Congress on March 5th. And this is an extremely important time when the tone is set in terms of policy growth and other targets for not just this coming year, 2026 calendar year, but for the 15th five-year plan, which is 2026 through 2030. And as we always know, and I think Mareike will agree with me on this, China loves to not have things upset its pre-programmed, choreographed sort of way of proceeding about things. And so I suspect that maybe China will sort of stay quiet, at least until some of the internal targets are projected for this week. And Steve, I'm happy to go into some of my beliefs about how this is going to pan out. I think we're going to see a lot of policy stability, not a lot of stimulus from China. I also, of course, spent a good portion of January in China, and I know we'll come to it later, but we can also talk about how China's relatively, I think, complacent right now about being able to at least stabilize growth. And given you could say some of the US-China wins that kind of went in China's favor, including China being able to weaponize rare earths last year and kind of talk the US down from a very heavy tariff and export control perch. All of these may be making China believe that it's kind of sitting pretty going into these late March negotiations with President Trump.
Mm-hmm. So, Mareike, do you think China thinks it's sitting pretty?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to continue to, do verbal condemnations because it does feel like it can really drive home some messages it has been sending towards various countries that are largely grouped together as the global South, even though they have quite different interests, right? So it can basically score rhetorical wins, but I don't think it's gonna do much beyond that. I do think that I agree that if this carries on for longer and there might be a risk to China's to something more substantial, it might start to reach out to the Trump administration and say, hey, you're really interested in this April meeting. Why don't you make sure that there's a little bit more of a constructive atmosphere? And we know that the Trump administration has put things in place to watch for things that might upset China, that might dislodge this meeting. So there would be some receptiveness towards that within limits, right? But for that, it would really it would take a while.
Mm-hmm. Mareike, let's actually hone in on Friedrich Merz's trip to China for just a little bit. On his trip, the chancellor emphasized stronger economic cooperation despite overarching geopolitical shifts and the great power competition that we're seeing unfold. He talked about, quote, a balanced, reliable, and fair partnership with China, and I would think that that sentiment is probably still true, even as we see the conflict in the Middle East unfold and perhaps test transatlantic unity. What were the main messages that Merz had going into his trip? And do you think he got those messages across and took away what he needed to have that balanced, reliable, and fair partnership with China?
Now I'm struggling with the unmute button. So, two to three things that I think he really wanted to get across. And the first one is around market distortions, right? He had a mandate, a very strong mandate, to communicate to China that Germany is upset with any market distorting practices, whether that is subsidies, whether that is, I guess now more importantly, currency manipulation. Or control over, Tara already mentioned China weaponizing rare earths quite successfully last year, right? So one of the main messages he had to convey and really wanted to convey, of course, is that Germany doesn't like it and is hoping that China will change, right? The second two messages are, one, of course, one thing that every German official, every German leader has brought up with the Chinese is China's support for Russia in the war against Ukraine, right? That is something that every German leader will bring up with them. And then he does overall, I think, feel strongly that Taiwan is, if something happens in the Taiwan Strait, that is going to affect German interests. And Friedrich Merz has been communicating on that fairly strongly, usually towards a European or transatlantic audience. But the topic did apparently come up between Xi and Merz, was brought up by Xi Jinping, and then they had debate around there. Now, so he did, in a way, get the points across that he wanted to get across or had to get across. I see a couple of problems with that, though. The first is that you have a lot of confusion. You have a German government that has official policy of de-risking, right? And that was, of course, started under the previous government in 2023. Germany brought out a China strategy where it laid out, some of these those approaches. The current government, in its coalition agreement, doubled down on that, highlighted systemic rivalry with China, right? So you have this rhetoric on the one hand, but then what do you have in terms of policy, right? Like, so far, we haven't really seen Germany get around to that, and unless Germany takes action on that, there is a problem. So you have, on the one hand, this de-risking approach, but then you also have Friedrich Merz going to China, talking about partnership, adopting incredibly friendly language. So you're kind of left to wonder, okay, where do things add up? And I think the bigger problem for me, of course, and this applies both to the market distortion stuff, but also to China's support for Russia, is on its own, Germany has very limited leverage, right? So if Friedrich Merz goes to China and says, "Pretty please stop manipulating your currency," there's really there's no reason for China to actually do that. So they can nod and say, "Yes, yes, yes, we hear you," but there's no way it's going to change. The only way that Germany can actually exert some kind of influence on China that has, it's not going to change everything, because there are reasons why China is doing what it's doing, but it has a way to exert leverage, is via the EU, right? Because the EU does have trade instruments that technically it could use, and Germany could absolutely work via the EU. I think if Germany were to drive a more aggressive, a tougher approach on China via Brussels, there would be ways for it to do that. And you can talk about, disunity and China working with individual countries inside the EU. That's all true. They're close to Hungary, close to Slovakia. They've been reaching out to Spain. But if Germany throws its weight behind a tougher approach on China at the EU level, they would probably be quite successful with that, right? So the idea that Germany can go to Beijing and appeal to it and say, please change your approach, but not really have any leverage to back that up, that's a problem, right? And they could integrate, Europe more closely, right? You've had Emmanuel Macron, who has been taking people like the European Commission along on his visit. So there are ways to show that you're not just here as Germany, but as Europe. And so far, Germany has chosen not to do that.
Mm-hmm. I think we'll come back to sort of the German and European pressure on China and where it can exert some of that pressure, where there are the pressure points, if you will. But I found it really interesting to hear what you were talking about in terms of some of the issues that were on the agenda for the Merz visit. And Tara, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, you recently traveled to China. You spent some time there. Does what Mareike just described to us match with sort of some of the issues that you observed when you were there on the ground? Were there any surprising dynamics that you observed or local perspectives that stood out that were maybe different from some of the official messaging?
Thanks, Steve. And first of all, I just like to add one point to Mareika's excellent analysis of the Xi-Merz conversation itself, which is, of course, the perspective of German industry. I mean, there's so much confliction, you could say, on the German business side, because on one hand, of course, I think the BDI was among the groups that counseled Merz to push back on China on overcapacity and unfair industrial subsidies and such. But on the other hand, we have to remember that in 2026, China became Germany's top trading partner. China displaced the US. And ultimately, a business delegation did sort of go with Merz, and we did get at least one deal, right, with China agreeing to buy more Airbus jets. And so there's I think that tension right now where the German economy, both from the importer and exporter side, continues to be quite dependent on China, both as a market and also as a place to manufacture. And that tension was also very evident, by the way, when I was on the ground in China. Granted, I went and visited many Chinese policymakers as well, not just, of course, European, US Chamber of Commerce equivalent interlocutors, but first of all, just some on the ground insights. Again, going into the 5-year plan, I would still maintain that while I think some of the drivers of Chinese growth are still right now stagnant or even moribund, including the Chinese consumer. I noticed that there was not a whole lot of buying activity happening, and this was just before Chinese New Year with lots and lots of discounts and incentives in all the shops. So the Chinese consumer is definitely not yet a big engine of growth. The property sector continues to be a problem, and bringing down very high local government debt levels is still a perennial concern within the Chinese government. And so all of these growth, you could say, headwinds do persist going into the next 5-year plan and into 2026. But if you look at the policy rhetoric and also what I heard from a lot of the Chinese officials, and even in their stance about how to deal with the US or Europe, it was again coming from this point of, I won't call it necessarily complacency, but this assumption that, okay, China has a stable growth model now. Exports have been doing very well, and frankly will probably continue to do well, even though China is trying to say that they want to shift more towards a domestic demand driven model. And that again goes back to our main concern, and I think Mareike will agree with me that I think overcapacity is set to persist. And we know that overcapacity has definitely, even more than the US, which has kind of put a bunch of barriers against China really dumping onto their markets. Europe is a big victim of this. It's exporting deflation. It's also of obviously hurting local industries. And I suspect that this is going to continue, that this will continue to be a driver of growth. Separately, of course, we have the whole new productive forces, right? Whether this be AI, advanced manufacturing and technology, robotics, green energy, places where China either has already established a certain level of dominance, at least in scale, or still wants to. And I have to offer an amusing anecdote that I went to at least 2 different robotics hubs to watch all the robots sing and dance and do all the kinds of things that Friedrich Merz and, by the way, a few weeks ago, apparently President Xi had also seen at the same facilities. So China is definitely trying to promote its deep-seek moment and possibly its humanoid robots moment as ways to try to gain a technological edge, if not in absolute competency, at least in scale and efficiency and cost. And so putting all this together, I do suspect, going back even to our earlier conversations about how China is going to manage the US-China talks soon and any conversations with Europe, I think China resolutely does believe that it holds economic leverage right now. That, again, the export engine region continues to be supremely competitive. And also separately, let's not forget two weapons that China has, not just, of course, rare earths, very, very potent weapon. They're even levying it hard now against the Japanese, but also legacy automobile chips. And we have the whole Nexperia spat still kind of brewing in the background. And just for our viewers' benefit, the Nexperia spat related to basically the Dutch not allowing the Chinese partner Wingtech of Nexperia to take over the company. And so there's this control spat between the Dutch government and the Chinese. And as a result, the Chinese have basically made it difficult to ship automobile chips from China to Europe. And this is a very, very significant supply bottleneck for European automakers. Mm-hmm. So I think all of this just boils down to China now feeling that it has various weapons of leverage. And so I go back to what Mareike also said earlier, which is I'm not sure that unless Europe really bands together with a cohesive anti-coercion instrument, that they have any leverage to offer right now.
Mareike, you're nodding your head. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I mean, just to confirm that there is like China, even though I don't think that China should be quite as confident, because there would be ways for both the United States and Europe to push back, but it feels like it currently has things firmly under control because transatlantic relations are sufficiently fragmented that it no longer has to worry about some kind of coordination around this. And then it feels like it has Europe under control because leaders, in part because leaders are lining up to go to China one by one instead of showing up together, but also because, yes, it has used those more coercive instruments and has found that they work. So it is right now very confident. But I mean, if there were, basically the problem for Europe is if the trade war between the US and China, if tariffs go up, anything that doesn't go to the US goes to Europe, and that's already a problem for Europe, right? Mm-hmm. So if there really is, if China does push Europe too far, I do wonder if this absolute confidence on China's part is justified, because it is, we are beginning to feel the effects quite strongly of what, here is what is discussed as the second China shock, right? This is not theoretical for us. We've had in Germany mass layoffs. We've had factories closed, right? So for Germany, it is about deindustrialization, and it's quite existential in a way. So I do wonder if at some point, if Chinese confidence is completely justified, because again, we do have ways of protecting ourselves and of pushing back against this.
So we actually just received a question from somebody that I think ties in very nicely here. Let me read it to you, and it's addressed to both of you. Both the EU and China have expressed concerns about subsidies, lack of market access, and export controls for several years. At this point, can you identify a clear strategy to achieve a change in Chinese policy on these issues? And if not, does this have more to do with Germany or with the EU? And I would add, or with China?
If I can just start an initial stab at that, while I do sympathize with what Mareike is saying about Europe having leverage, I'm still not sure that they are at the point where they are ready to exercise that leverage. Partly because, especially given the other economic headwinds right now, right, there's a good chance European gas prices, at least temporarily, are going to go through the roof because of this Iran issue. We're talking about possible, slowdown in global economic activity as a result of another salvo of tariffs. I'm not completely sure that Europe might be ready to take on China on various fronts. Granted, and this is a great question from the audience, there are tools that can be pulled. In fact, I know specifically questions regarding market access and subsidies were mentioned. And definitely, if Europe really enforces its anti-coercion instrument, which would mean also difficulty investing at all in various sensitive sectors in Europe, difficulty in accessing government procurement, procurement in a way that so far have not been limited to China in quite the same way as the US has, right? The US has really created this ring fence, not allowing Chinese electric vehicles in. Granted, there's some transactionality within the US about whether they might allow some Chinese investment in, but that's being pushed back against Congress. Mm-hmm. In Europe, we're still hearing all these stories of basically China being able to invest, onshore in Europe, at least in some non-sensitive sectors. Whether there will be some kind of push to try to prevent that, but then that also hurts Europe, because if anything, I think the only thing Europe should be doing is saying, okay, China can invest in these sectors in Europe. However, there has to be mandated technology transfer. That China basically has to bring some of its know-how, and some of the ability to scale up, create the efficiencies, create the competitiveness that it has been able to do on the ground in China. Basically, bring some of that know-how here. But other than that, and going back also to the question of Germany versus Europe, I think a lot of this also has to do with internal competitiveness measures that are being put forward in Europe. And Steve, we've had many webinars on this subject. Yeah. I would say Germany has done a great start, right? Whether it be with at least this new Zeitenwende of opening up the fiscal to do more, both infrastructure and defense spending, although we have to see, the proof is in the pudding. That's still more than the limited fiscal room other Europeans have. And similarly, Germany has started to cut some red tape, started to address energy costs and such. But I would just maintain that a lot of the regulatory burden of trying to improve competitiveness still resides at the European level. And the fragmented nature, the strategic cacophony of all the European nations and their different regulatory agendas, different speed economies, I think is going to make it a little difficult, in the very short term, for Europe to really band together and be comprehensively be able to push back against China.
Mm-hmm. Just to add to that, first off, I completely agree with you. I don't think that Europe will manage to use, or if Europe somehow manages to use some of the instruments, it's gonna be similar to what we had when we had the EV tariffs, right? We have something that by European standards is a massive step, and that got pushed through with all the effort and faced headwinds, but by US standards, people are like, so yeah, okay, this is a very lukewarm measure, right? So even if Europe manages to push something through, it will probably not be enough. I doubt that's going to be the case. On why this hasn't changed, a couple of things, and one is I do think for the longest time there's been the problem that you deal with the Chinese system and you somehow still have your own system at the back of your head. And you have a system that plays by completely different rules, and in many cases use the same language. So, you have the same, you talk about markets and you talk about multilateralism, but it does things differently. So it really took governments here in Europe a while to begin to understand what problem it was facing. But then also you had a system that is really, really good at dividing and conquering, right? And of playing different member states against one another, of playing local governments and national governments against each other, of playing business and government against each other, and of just making sure that no decisive action emerges. And that really was that was really what dominated. I think that was really, really relevant in the years between 2016 to 2020. It was like it could play people against each other. Now, I feel like at the end of 2024, we were in a position, if things hadn't blown up transatlantically, where there was actually a chance that there could have been some kind of joint action. The European Commission had prepared quite a bit for becoming tougher on China and had started to come up with a package that it wanted to reach out to the Trump administration. Now, of course, that never came to pass, because then you had a trade war between the United States and Europe, right? So it's in a way that is extra ironic that at this one moment where we finally had a commission that had finally made it to the stage where it had instruments put together, that also didn't happen simply because transatlantic relations took a different turn.
So Mareike, let me push you on that just a little bit. I think it'd be really interesting to hear from you how you see the German sort of sentiment toward the transatlantic partnership influencing or shaping the debate over China? You've already touched a little bit on how there's been a little bit of an evolution from the last German government, the traffic light coalition, to the current government. But I think more broadly, we've seen a number of developments over the last 2 years, 3 years, that have shaped public perception, but also business interests. Can you talk a little bit about how that German sentiment is shaping how China is viewed?
Sure. And I think this is not necessarily a problem of the German government, although you can see some of it in how the government acts. But the idea is, okay, we now have problems with the Trump administration. We cannot open another big battle with China. So really, we need to make sure that relations with China are better and that we don't, pick too many fights at the same time. This is a very common argument in the German debate. We already saw this even after Russia attacked Ukraine. We already saw this with some Germans saying, hey, we can't afford to pick a battle with China right now because we're already fighting with Russia, so we can't have, battles with too many at the same time. The problem with this approach is that, of course, the issues that Germany faces vis-a-vis China don't magically go away simply because Germany doesn't wants to have better partnerships. It just means that it's under more pressure to act against its own interests vis-a-vis China so as not to rock the boat. And that ultimately isn't going to resolve the problem. There is, I think, also there's perpetual nervousness in Germany, not entirely without cause, that there might be some kind of US-China deal, maybe not a grand bargain, but there could be, the US and China could figure things out, and then Europe has a problem, right? So there's always this concern, okay, what if they manage to figure out some kind of deal, even if it's kind of a messy deal or some kind of messy arrangement, right? We're going to be carrying the stick, and we're gonna have this problem. So why don't we need to also hedge and make sure that we maintain good relations? And that is what's driving a lot of what we've been seeing during the visit by Friedrich Merz, but also I think by other leaders. And we've had Keir Starmer, Mark Carney. They arguably had much more favorable for Beijing kinds of visits. So it's just a key dynamic that you can see across Europe, that you can see across U.S. allied countries, that they're really concerned about this.
I think what you're describing is true of Germany, but also other European countries, right? They're forced to balance their own national economic interests with the geopolitical concerns that they have, given the backdrop against which everybody is operating right now. Tara, as Mareike was speaking, you were nodding your head. I want to give you a chance to react if there's anything that you'd like to say. But otherwise, I did want to bring sort of Taiwan into the picture, because we've gotten a couple of questions that are sort of Taiwan adjacent. But before we do that, Tara, is there anything that you'd like to add?
No, I completely agree with this. I think also right now the Europeans are going to have to be very careful with how they tread with President Trump. After all, we're still in that narrow period right after the Supreme Court ruled the IEEPA tariffs to be invalid, and now President Trump is trying to think of new ways to reimpose tariffs to keep the existing tariff structure largely intact. And I would also suspect, this is maybe a preview to Chancellor Merz's visit tomorrow to the White House, but I would venture, even for instance, given the kind of rhetoric that Chancellor Merz made, I think over this tonight, that is last night, on regards Iran, very measured comments, trying not to actively criticize U.S. actions, itself shows how Europe is hamstrung right now, that they really especially cannot afford to alienate the U.S. on any flank, and then maybe kind of try to negotiate EU-U.S. this not quite a deal, but you could say at least a détente at this point, and then try to think of how to manage this additional contingency that Mareike mentioned, that possibly US and China just come up with some very transactional deal, possibly throw Taiwan under the bus, and we'll talk about that now. And therefore, Europe has to be very careful, especially not to peeve the US. On Taiwan, I'm going to leave the majority of answering the question to Mareike, because as the Indo-Pacific team at GMF and her colleague Bonnie Glaser are preeminent in the field, I'll mostly leave it to her. But just a few basic comments. It would seem that there have already been a lot of warning signs for quite some time now, right? That whether it be for US companies or for Europe, that they've been advised to start to think of how to break away from dependency on Taiwan and the advanced chip manufacturing there, just because of this, contingency risk also, that possibly President Trump is not that much worried anymore about protecting Taiwan for the sake of, national security or for the sake of earlier covenants. But now, if for some reason he could onshore some of Taiwan's manufacturing activity to the US, that he becomes less directly dependent on the Taiwan, as an island itself, and therefore could give away some you could say concessions to China in return for assurances that China will not cut off rare earth exports and such. I would just point out, I don't think Taiwan is going to lose its silicon shield, as they call it. It's because even the US-Taiwan deal that has attempted to onshore to the US some of the advanced semiconductor manufacturing is not going to go very far. Taiwan has already made it clear that the crown jewels are going to be kept at home. Secondly, this is almost a subject for a completely different webinar, but while there has been a lot of these investment commitments into the US by a bunch of different countries making deals, including Taiwan, the actual materialization of the deals is yet to be seen. Also because thanks to internal US constraints, including lack of skilled labor, permitting issues, high costs, etc., it's going to be very difficult to suddenly start manufacturing 2 nanometer, 3 nanometer chips here in the US. So I still maintain that Taiwan, because of its leading edge on chips, because of TSMC, is still going to be able to retain some protections from China, even if there's a possibility that China gets the US to change language a little bit. I do think that this will hold for the next few years, because I'm not very sanguine about the US ability to wean off of Taiwan. On the European side, though, I just want to point out, both on Taiwan and even on other things like rare earths dependencies, I'm afraid that Europe is even further behind the US. You could say that even if, let's say in the next 5 to 10 years, the US is able to wean off of Taiwan chips or start to wean off of Chinese rare earths, and even that will be a gradual process, I fear that Europe is even further behind, right? Because they don't have quite the same, supply chain commitments that the US has. They don't have the wherewithal, and President Trump may be using other methods of leverage like tariffs and export controls even to kind of force some of these things to come to the US. I don't think Europeans will do that. So that's my concern, that Europe is going to stay perpetually a few steps behind, even as maybe the US starts to catch up on some of its dependencies to China. But I'd love to hear Mareike's thoughts.
Yeah, Mareike, as you sort of respond to this, there is a question from one of our viewers, which has to do with whether in Germany there have been discussions about the need for German businesses to have a plan B when it comes to dealing with China, but when it also comes to dealing with Taiwan and these mutual dependencies. So I think that that's also a factor of what you might share with us now.
Sure. So I mean, there's been the plan B it's definitely been on companies' minds since at least February 2023, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and companies started thinking about all kinds of contingencies, right? So there was suddenly this whole idea, okay, when is China gonna invade Taiwan? By when do we have to be ready? So I got a bunch of messages around that. It's like, give me a date, give me a year, give me a month, right? So there's been that concern has been there. I feel like in terms of how to, at the time, what companies settled on, and that's not going to solve the issue, but was, supply chain, like having different supply chains for different markets and making sure that they can have a clean separation of China business and other global businesses. So to building up multiple separate supply chains, right? And to be able to separate their China entity from their other entities. So that was some of the solution for that. That's not going to solve all of Germany's issues. We've seen last year the rare earth question became quite acute when companies suddenly found out that they had to send over all kinds of sensitive proprietary data to China in order to even get rare earths, right? So that was when that became acute. So that certainly got people thinking. I agree with Tara that Europe's going to be behind the United States on this, probably for the most part. This would have also been, and again, I hate to say should have, could have, would have, right? But this would have been a good allied project. This is something, diversifying rare earth supply chains is something that you should have done with allies and partners. The problem now is that this is, of course, a pretty long-term project, right? The timelines that we've heard in the United States for how fast this should go is definitely something that's not achievable broadly, right? That's for like very specific products. Perhaps you can work on these very short timelines, but by and large, it's multi-year projects to build this up. So that would have been a great allied project. I don't think the trust is there right now to do that together. That's the problem. Quickly on Taiwan, if you want me to respond to that as well.
Sure.
I think I agree that it's going to be absolutely true that the US is not going to be able to replace Taiwan on this, because simply it's not worked so far. It's incredibly difficult to manufacture these kinds of semiconductors. That's not something you pick up very quickly, and the US doesn't have the people, the infrastructure. There's a lot about talent, right? I don't think so there is that question that the US really won't be able to afford to do this, but nonetheless, China is, I think right now, it is very much hoping that it is going to be able to exert enough pressure on Taiwan to force some kind of peaceful solution from the Taiwanese side that's obtained under massive coercion, right? So I do think that, yes, China wants to be, the official timeline is the PLA is supposed to be ready by its 100th birthday to invade, but it is hugely risky. So China is hoping to get a non-kinetic solution to its problem, to be able to just put enough pressure on Taiwan, make sure that Taiwan is so internationally isolated, using, psychological operations against Taiwan in order to send the message you are on your own. The US will not help you with your only option. You have no other option but to agree to some kind of peaceful unification with China, right? And it's throwing a lot of efforts at that. It's been, it's always prioritized that, and it feels that right now there's an opening maybe to drive that message home, to make sure that Taiwan is isolated, to do the legal preparation for some of this, to have the legal work. My boss Bonnie Glaser has written on the UN resolution and how China has been pushing other countries to basically say, this resolution establishes that Taiwan is a part of China, which is a misinterpretation, but that's kind of the legal work that it's trying to do, so that by the time something happens, China can say, but internationally, the international community agrees that Taiwan is a part of China, right? So it's doing all of these steps to try to put pressure on Taiwan to basically feel like it is out of options.
So related to this, in light of Putin's attack on Ukraine 4 years ago, in light of the US arrest of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela earlier this year, and now the huge American military deployment in the Middle East and the attack on Iran, one of our viewers is curious whether Beijing might now feel more free to behave as it wishes in its own region and in its own waters. Did these other developments sort of make a sort of bona fide attack on Taiwan a little bit more likely in either of your minds?
So if I can, Mareike, go ahead, please.
Sure, I can start and then you can fill in. So
Of course.
I don't think it changes the calculus that much, I will say. There is some effect on this that yes, you can argue that nobody believes in international order anymore and therefore China is less constrained. But China has its own reasons for wanting Taiwan, wanting to attack Taiwan. It has its own timelines and it has its own reasons why it may not want to have an actual war because again it's very, very risky, right? So in the end it's already been doing this preparatory work for why an invasion of Taiwan would not be illegal and why it is an entirely domestic affair. So there's a very limited effect that these actions have on the calculus of China in this regard. And I know, I've seen this argument, and I do think there is some lot. I do worry that we're really completely going in terms of international order, we're completely taking the whole thing apart, and that is going to have some kinds of effect for how other countries act. But I don't think it's going to change much about the immediate calculus that China has. I mean, if you think about decapitation strikes, China's been planning for decapitation strikes for a long time. So the question of the legality of that has not been a concern for China. The argument has been, oh, Putin could do that now. Well, Putin attempted a decapitation strike on Ukraine in 2023, right? It didn't succeed, but it was certainly an attempted decapitation strike. So a lot of those things have already been done and have not really been a problem for either China or Russia in the past. So the overall calculus is not affected that much. It does give China some opportunity again to try to present itself as an upholder of stability and the US as a source of chaos, which is a narrative that it's been pushing for a really long time, much longer than before the second Trump administration, right? But that's kind of separate from the actual calculus changing.
And I completely 100% agree with everything you've said. And I would just further add, you could say, evidence for those things. Finally, on the last point that you had mentioned, you talked about, again, China wanting to exercise soft power as saying, okay, we are now a more predictable, reliable ally than, let's say, even the US, right? And I think, if anything, China will use this more strategically long term, like in its interactions with Belt and Road, in trying to, forge more, you could say, long term relationships, kind of weaning even some of the US's allies away from the US in a way. I mean, we're talking even about pivotal shifts like Canada allowing Chinese electric vehicles into the country. So I think China will use this more as soft power to say, yeah, we are now a less volatile and more predictable world power than the US. So I don't think that will be used immediately to say, let's use the US playbook or the Russia playbook to invade Taiwan. The other two things have to do with domestic issues in China. I mean, there's also been a lot of consternation about how President Xi has been systematically purging officials around him, right, including a very, very large proportion of almost all of the Central Military Commission is gone, and a lot of generals are gone. And so while this could work both ways, it could be a smoke screen for to make the world believe that China is somehow hamstrung right now, that its military is in shambles, whereas actually in the background they may be building up their defenses strongly. That might be the case, but the point is, right now we're in a situation where I think President Xi is more trying to assert his authority over the leadership structure. And the second thing, again, going back to what Mareike was pointing out about this being a huge risk, I think at a time when the economy is just about stabilizing, right, and ultimately it's still the export engine that's working, as I mentioned, consumer, property, the main drivers that are really what people on the ground in the mainland care about, those are still very shaky. And so I think it would be very, very risky to attempt something against Taiwan, especially if all your amphibious warfare, everything isn't completely lined up. And then the final aspect is, I think this is something that everyone who's been covering how US might react to a blockade by China of Taiwan or invasion of Taiwan. I mean, the onslaught, you could say the repercussions repercussions for China after they do something like that, including in the form of, international sanctions, international blockade. I mean, we could end up blockading the Straits of Malacca and making, it difficult for China trade to traverse to the rest of the world. I think China is much more strategic about worrying about those knock-on risks, that I don't think they're just going to take this window chance that, okay, a lot of US force posture has moved towards the Western Hemisphere and towards the Middle East, and therefore they're going to strike. Mareike, what do you think?
No, in terms of China using something like this as a spontaneous possible, like to use that spontaneously, that's be quite hard. Because also, I mean, this depends on a lot of different things, including time of year and preparation. So the idea that it's gonna use this to just, oh, now we're gonna spontaneously invade Taiwan, that is not also simply not possible, right? So there are some concerns, for instance, about, for instance, Russia and China coordinating attacks. That's something that definitely Europeans take into account. What if you have that? But that's a different kind of story, because that would be longer in the making. Even that, that would be a very different story than China opportunistically exploiting this, or even exploiting a new pretext or a change in international order.
You were both, talking a little bit about some of the positives, if you will, some of the ways in which China might use soft power to increase its influence. And certainly earlier in our conversation, Tara talked a little bit about specific sectors of the German economy that are particularly exposed, like the automotive sector. But in terms of trade and investment, particularly on the heels of the Merz visit, are there areas where new opportunities for collaboration exist, right? In terms of trying to build a positive relationship with China. Is there anything that either of you have in your mind where you think that there are some positives, instead of the very somewhat bleak and very challenging conversation that we've been having so far when it comes to dealing with China?
So I thought it was interesting that one of the areas of collaboration President Xi mentioned to Chancellor Merz was on AI. Which is fascinating. You can argue that Europe is one step removed from the big US-China AI race, because Europe frankly, right now doesn't have too much of a dog in the fight. Although we have, I think in Europe, though unfortunately not German, it's a Dutch company. We have ASML, which is going to be extremely important in terms of chip making equipment. So if Europe could, create some more of these kinds of national champions in the AI supply chain, that would be one thing. I don't know how feasible real AI cooperation is going to be, especially given these tensions right now about AI now becoming very integral to national security, and everyone wanting to not just, of course, secure rare earth and commodity supply chains, but probably also want to insulate their AI supply chains from China, given the obvious security risks. I would say again, I go back to my original suggestion about the answer to the previous question about what Europe could maybe do, both as a carrot and a stick, is to say, okay, if China does want to invest in Germany or in Europe, that it has to come with this condition of some level of technology transfer, so that at least the domestic industry can benefit from some of these economies of scale and understanding the latest developments that China has been able to do. But it's a little bit difficult right now to see where there are going to be specific sectors where there can be outright cooperation, because again, going back to this belief that China is going to persist with the export engine and with overcapacity as a way to continue to at least stabilize growth while everything else at home is not necessarily looking so hot. I think if anything, the risk is more that Germany and Europe as a whole, of course, have to put up some defenses, probably more protectionism rather than active collaboration.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not famous for advocating for more. I mean, I don't think that there's no room at all for collaboration and partnership, but it's quite limited. I mean, usually people the boxes people check is on climate.
Yeah.
And there's definitely room for some kind of collaboration and cooperation on that. But again, you have the same deindustrialization problem that, for instance, on renewables. I mean, Europe used to have quite a strong industry in that sector, and that got, of course, overtaken by China through, not always fair market principles, right? So we have a bit of a problem there as well. So yes, there are technical areas where there can be some cooperation. I agree that Europe needs to put its foot down more on, reverse technology transfers and as a condition for access. But I also agree it's quite limited.
So let's close sort of where we started by bringing the conflict in Iran sort of back into the conversation. We touched briefly on energy, and it's clear that China relies heavily on energy from the Middle East. It has its own economic ties with Iran, which of course could be affected by the current crisis. And I guess the question I would have to each of you in closing is given China's significant energy imports from the Middle East and its economic ties to Iran, how do you think that the current conflict in Iran and the broader geopolitical tensions, how might they shape the agenda for the talks between Trump and Xi when it comes to trade, security, and global governance? And do you think that Beijing might use its position on Iran to extract some concessions or some leverage when it comes to some of the other strategic issues that might be on the agenda?
So if I may take a crack, a short-term risk is, of course, how long this immediate salvo of U.S. action against Iran and the counterattacks on the region are going to continue. I would venture if this is something that winds down relatively quickly, not only will global oil markets basically the issues subside, but I think China will be fine because again, China has stockpiled a lot of oil, and if anything, its reliance on oil per se has gone down a lot just because of this push for renewables and electrification through other sources as well. So in the very short term, I don't think China is going to really feel the energy squeeze. But definitely, if this pushes past a few weeks, then we really start to worry. And some media outlets have already started to become concerned whether this will impinge on the Trump-Xi talks. My guess is that again, China has the usual tools of leverage, right? They can very gently say to the US, look, we it's not just hurting Iran, it's hurting your allies in the region. It's going to, by the way, also destabilize shipping around the world and bring up inflation and such. So for many reasons, including your own domestic population, it makes good sense to wind this down. If President Trump still is like, okay, no, this is something we need to continue to do, I think then China may start to subtly roll back out its own weaponization tools, right? It's leverage, whether it be the rare earth export controls, whether it be automobile chip controls. And I think the other thing that we have to watch out is whether China actually short term trades letting the US do what it wants on Iran in return for a change in language on Taiwan. I know Mareike and I talked extensively about how we don't think China will actively attack or invade Taiwan in the short term. But I do think it will be, again, going back to the point of peaceful, rhetorical kind of, dominance by the mainland over the island. I think if they could generate at the meeting, if President Xi could say, okay, I look the other way, President Trump, as you continue your actions in Iran. And I will also not, actively aid and abet Iran. I will not send them ship killer missiles or something. But at the same time, in return, President Trump, you have to give me a change in language on Taiwan, that US actively opposes Taiwan independence. I think that is, again, it's not an immediate step towards war between China and Taiwan, but it's a paradigm shift that would be seen as a big win for China. So it's possible that we move towards that if there's nothing else on the table that President Trump can give President Xi at the meetings.
Thank you. And Mareike, the last word goes to you.
Two very quick points since we are at the hour. The first one is by our current timelines, April is a long, long time away. We have so many developments that could still happen between now and then that I feel like in our new timelines, I hate to speculate about anything that's going to happen more than 48 hours from now. And that's simply the world we live in now. But the second point is, I think what we're going to need to look at is to what extent does the Chinese government feel it's not going to go defend Iran. It's not gonna do that kind. To what extent does the Chinese government feel that what is happening is a threat to itself and can impact its own interests, or could even become a threat to itself? And that is something to watch. And the moment that it feels like this could have a destabilizing effect on China, China is going to act, and it's going to start to put pressure on the United States to actually change its course, right? As long as China doesn't feel that this is existential for itself or it really touches its interests, it is much more likely to try to choose a different approach and to reserve its cards for stuff that it considers essential for its own, economic well-being, for the CCP's own regime security. That's generally how China acts on those matters. So it's really going to depend, as Tara already said, how this develops, and if this is anything that China could threaten its actual vital interests.
Well, Mareike, herzlichen Dank. Tara, many, many thanks. Big thanks to you both. This has been a very thoughtful conversation and very wide-ranging conversation. Obviously, lots to think about in the weeks and months ahead. And Mareike, I think you were absolutely right in terms of pointing out, the end of March feels like it's very far away at this point, and a lot can happen. But I think you've both given us a tremendous amount of food for thought for things to watch over the next few weeks and in the coming days. So I want to thank both of you for making the time to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you.